Tensions in Soweto and the surrounding areas have calmed after widespread looting in the region. It came after the shooting of a 14-year-old boy by a foreign national. The incident sparked looting of stores in the area owned by foreign nationals, and although police just called it common criminality, many South Africans found it reminiscent of the 2008 xenophobic attacks in South Africa. Now, Paul McNally and his team at the Wits Radio Academy for this week's episode of The Science Inside looked at the science behind migration, xenophobia, and even bacteria in the guts of different people from different nationalities. Paul, you've got to kick us off with that. I was horrified at the amount of germs that get swapped between people just when they kiss.
I know. I mean, so was I. And it's this idea that is in all of us. There are billions of bacteria that aren't just in our stomachs, but they're also on our skin, on our faces, all around us. We have billions and billions of them. And because we wanted to look at migration and the science around that, we looked at what happens when you go to a new place. Like, what happens to the city of bacteria that's inside you? How does that change? And it changes extremely. It's drastic.
It's absolutely fascinating. Now, when you began the episode, you kicked us off with a small soundbite in which an expert describes that many of the preconceived notions we have about foreign nationals in South Africa are unfounded. For instance, the belief that foreign nationals steal our jobs, or that there are over 2 million Zimbabweans in South Africa. You kick us off by explaining that those figures actually don't really have much of a base.
Yeah, I mean, we started the episode by going to the African Center for Migration and Society, and they very clearly set out how people are very emotional around this topic. And when it comes to data, first of all, our data is very sparse, and second of all, people have an inclination to sort of make up data. So they will, and you'll have had this argument with lots of people, they will say very strictly, yes, I know that 2 million people, X and Y, or stole this job. And really, it's just entirely anecdotal. And they admit that, and the expert we speak to says that explains how people pull together these different anecdotes that are in their lives and convert that into data, which then they use for sort of a scientific argument.
Obviously, the problem comes in when we start trumping up this made-up data, and places like Twitter and Facebook are often, this false information is readily shared. I know I see it on my Facebook feed all the time. One stupid piece of misinformation gets shared and shared and shared, and that's how the problem begins.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just keeps going more and more. And also, I mean, to get back to the bacteria, that's also why we wanted to look at that, is that it's a completely different way of thinking about migration. So the idea that you can go to a different place and you can inherit all this different bacteria from what you eat and who you kiss in a new place, and that can lead to you changing. Your personality can change, the diseases that you contract can change. So the idea that your bacteria almost like informs you and changes who you are, and that migration can play a part in that.
Paul, let's go back to this topic of bacteria, because it sounds pretty gross, and the idea of having new strains of bacteria entering your body sounds awful. But at the end of the day, what your scientist was saying is it's not actually a bad thing. We need as much bacteria as we can get.
Yeah, well, we need some bacteria that's good. The idea is that you don't want to that's why you don't want to necessarily always take antibiotics, because that will just flush all the bacteria out, or a lot of the good bacteria out of you. So the idea is that we want to keep some of it inside us that will help us combat certain diseases. But also, what he was saying, which I found so fascinating, was the idea of once you get certain type of bacteria inside you, it can communicate with your bloodstream. And then once it can get into your bloodstream, it can get into your brain, and it can affect who you are. So there's almost this balance. And that's what he's looking into more and more, this idea of bacteria changing you. And especially he's looking at people who are migrating, and how when you move to a different place, it's not just necessarily stress. It can also be what you eat and who you kiss that can change who you are.
It's absolutely fascinating. Now, you also spoke to a social psychologist who spoke to us about prejudice. Obviously, when we see these things happening in the news, we realize that as South Africans, we're not exactly an open, welcoming society. And she spoke to us about why we feel prejudice towards other people who are different to us. And the bottom line is that it's taught. Somewhere along the line, we're taught to be prejudiced.
Yeah. I mean, it's a frightening idea. And she looks at a study from the 70s, quite a famous study where they split children according to their eye color. So it's like blue eyes or brown eyes. A teacher did it, and before you could, I don't think ethically you could do it now these days with little children, but to split them like that and then force them to be treated differently. And then by the end of the day, these children had sort of learnt prejudice. They had learnt to hate the blue-eyed kids, and the brown-eyed kids had learnt, and vice versa. And it just showed so dramatically that you can teach anyone to hate anyone. And not just that, not just openly, but you can ingrain it into someone over years and years. And one of our producers actually did a test and was pretty shocked at the findings that she found about how prejudiced she really was.
In fact, you give that link during the show, and if our users listen to the show, they can find that link and go and do the test themselves to see how prejudiced they are.
Yeah, if you want to, that's basically.
Yeah, we hold no responsibility for what you discover once you take that test. Now, let's speak a little bit about one of the last parts of this week's episode, and that's the way to get around Africa. You had a look at border control and just the ways that people move around Africa. Interestingly, South Africa is one of the very few places on the continent where refugees are allowed to freely move in the country. Am I getting this right?
Yeah, and I was apart from Egypt, apparently, and that a lot of countries they're forced to be put in camps, and that's why a lot of people want to come to South Africa. And really, in that story, we wanted to compare how people move around today and the sort of struggles that they face. And we spoke to someone at the Origin Center, the CEO there, and he crossed drastically with the idea of migration historically and how. Obviously, how we all come from Africa and how we moved from the cradle of humankind and took over the world. And it was so interesting to sort of compare this sort of very bleak picture of migration today and, this sort of rosy tinted historical view of Africa's narrative.
Paul, by the time you've listened to the whole episode of The Science Inside this week, you kind of get an idea that this concept of prejudice and migration is so much more complicated than we think it is.
Yeah, it's not just, we look into prejudice, but it is also not just about prejudice. It is about all these different concepts that sort of fit together, and often things that we're completely unaware of.
That was Paul McNally from the Wits Radio Academy. You can listen to the full episode of The Science Inside below this video. Let us know in the comments section below what you think after listening.